Evan lived a quiet life, far away from the busy cities, in a small wooden cabin surrounded by tall, whispering pine trees. His days were simple and predictable. He woke up with the sun, tended to his little garden, and spent hours looking at the sky with his telescope. Stars, planets, and distant galaxies fascinated him more than anything else. People in the nearby town considered him a little strange. They often laughed when he spoke about his dreams of finding life beyond Earth. But Evan didn't mind. He enjoyed the silence, the calm, and the endless sky above him. Nights were his favorite because the stars seemed alive, twinkling as if they had stories to tell. Every evening, he would climb the small hill behind his cabin, setting up his telescope to scan the heavens. Sometimes he would note strange patterns or lights, but most of the time it was just peaceful watching. One evening, as the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Evan noticed something unusual. At first, it was just a tiny flicker of light far away, moving in a way no plane or satellite ever moved. It hovered and then darted quickly, disappearing behind the trees. Evan rubbed his eyes and adjusted his telescope. What he saw next made his heart beat faster. Two bright lights appeared again, this time larger and closer, almost floating above the ground in the forest near his cabin. They moved with a smooth, deliberate motion, as if someone or something was guiding them. For a moment, Evan felt a shiver run down his spine. He had never seen anything like this before, not even in his dreams. Curiosity mixed with fear. He wanted to run back into his cabin, lock the door, and pretend he hadn't seen anything. But something inside him, the same thing that made him study the stars every night, urged him to watch. He grabbed a flashlight and carefully stepped outside, making sure the wind didn't carry the sound of his footsteps. As he approached the edge of the trees, the light of the mysterious figures became clearer. They were not like anything human. Their shapes were slightly elongated, with soft glowing outlines. And then, before Evan could take a full breath, they stepped into the clearing. They looked like two sisters. Their faces were delicate and symmetrical, with eyes that reflected light in a way that made Evan feel both welcomed and uneasy. Their hair shimmered slightly, as if made of strands of light rather than ordinary hair. Evan froze. He wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. The sisters smiled softly, a gentle and almost hypnotic smile that made him lower his guard. They moved gracefully, silently, as though their feet didn't touch the ground. One of them stepped forward and spoke, her voice melodic and calming. "We seek shelter," she said. It was not threatening, but there was something strange in her tone, something that made Evan feel he was being carefully observed. The words were clear, but the way she spoke made him aware that she could easily see into his thoughts, or at least understand much more than a normal visitor would. Despite the fear rising in his chest, Evan felt an unusual sense of responsibility. He couldn't explain why, but he wanted to help them. They didn't act like they wanted to harm him. There was a gentleness in their movements, a hesitation, almost like strangers who had been lost for a long time and were weary of the world around them. He remembered the lessons he had learned about kindness and curiosity from his childhood, about how the world sometimes held answers to questions you didn't even know you had. Slowly he stepped forward, gesturing toward his cabin. "You can come inside," he said, his voice shaking slightly. The sisters nodded in unison, and their eyes seemed to shine brighter, almost as if they had been waiting for this permission. Once inside, Evan noticed more unusual details. The way they moved was fluid, almost floating from one corner of the room to another. They didn't need to touch objects to understand them. They seemed to sense everything, from the slight temperature changes to the faint smell of the pine wood in his cabin. Evan tried to hide his astonishment, focusing instead on making them comfortable. He offered them chairs and a warm cup of tea, though he doubted they needed it. Still, they accepted it politely, sipping without a sound, their expressions calm and unreadable. During the first conversation, Evan asked simple questions about who they were and where they came from. Their answers were vague but polite. They spoke about traveling, about seeing new worlds, about wanting a quiet place to rest. Evan listened carefully, noting small inconsistencies in their stories. He sensed that they were hiding something, though he could not say what. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps it was a secret they couldn't reveal. Either way, Evan knew he needed to be cautious. He was not dealing with ordinary guests. Something about their presence, the way they seemed both human and not, made him alert. That night, after they settled in, Evan sat alone near the fireplace. The shadows of the flickering flames danced across the walls, mixing with the memories of what he had just seen. He thought about all the strange lights he had noticed in the sky over the years, about the endless hours he had spent searching for answers in the stars. Could these sisters be from another world, or were they something else entirely? The question burned in his mind. He realized that while he wanted to trust them, he also needed to understand their intentions fully. Something told him that appearances could be deceiving, and to know the truth, he would have to be clever. Evan decided to watch them closely. He didn't want to appear suspicious, so he pretended to be busy with his usual routines. He tidied up the cabin, prepared extra food, and occasionally glanced at them from the corner of his eyes. He observed their habits, their mannerisms, and the way they communicated with each other silently. Every movement, every glance seemed intentional, calculated. yet gentle. He sensed intelligence far beyond what he had ever encountered. And yet, there was a strange vulnerability in their presence, a subtle fear that something could go wrong if they were discovered. By the end of the night, Evan realized that his life had changed forever. What had been an ordinary evening, staring at the stars in peace, had turned into the beginning of something extraordinary. He didn't know if he could trust these sisters completely, but he knew one thing: he would need to uncover the truth, and he would need to do it carefully. Curiosity, caution, and a sense of wonder guided him as he prepared for the days ahead, ready to observe and learn more about the mysterious guests who had entered his quiet world. The days after the sisters arrived passed in a strange, almost hypnotic rhythm. Evan went about his usual routines, tending his garden and scanning the skies, but his attention was never far from Lyra and Kayleigh. There was something unusual about the way they moved, the way they spoke to each other, even the way they looked at him. Their conversations were quiet, almost secretive, often whispered, and Evan could sense that he was not always meant to understand them. Yet, every now and then, a word or phrase in English slipped through, leaving him with questions that he could not ignore. He realized that observing them would not be as simple as watching normal guests. There was a depth, an intelligence, and an alertness in them that he had never encountered before. From the very first morning, he noticed the precision in their actions. They organized things in his cabin without touching everything physically, arranging objects almost by thought or by sensing their weight and position. When Evan asked a simple question like, "Do you want tea?" they would respond in perfect harmony, as if they had rehearsed it. Yet the way they said it felt almost careful, like they were measuring their words. Sometimes they glanced at each other and exchanged subtle signals that Evan could not interpret, and he began to suspect they had their own language or method of communication that he could not understand. It made him both fascinated and uneasy. Evan also observed how they reacted to the world outside. They would move to the windows, looking at the stars with a strange intensity, almost as if they were reading the sky like a map. They sometimes pointed to constellations and whispered in their melodic language, and Evan noticed that their eyes shone with a reflection of the starlight, but also something else: curiosity, caution, and maybe even worry. They didn't seem to belong to this place, this planet, or even the air itself. He realized that if they were truly visitors from somewhere else, understanding them would require patience, careful observation, and clever thinking. What made Evan even more cautious was their interest in his cabin and the surrounding area. They asked questions about his electricity, about the small wind turbine he had installed, and about how humans communicate over long distances. At first, Evan thought their questions were innocent, driven by curiosity, but slowly he realized the questions were precise, almost technical. They wanted to understand how things worked here, not in a casual sense, but in a way that suggested they might need that knowledge for a purpose he could not yet see. It made him tense. Why would travelers, however unusual, need to know these specific things about his home and the world outside? Despite his growing suspicions, Evan tried to remain calm. He knew he had to act naturally. If he showed too much fear or curiosity, it might alert them. So he observed quietly, often from another room or by pretending to be absorbed in his telescope. He noticed subtle patterns in their behavior. Lyra often seemed to lead conversations, her voice soft but commanding, while Kayleigh was quieter, more hesitant, but equally attentive. They shared glances, small gestures, and sometimes almost imperceptible nods that indicated they were communicating without words. Evan understood that they had a bond deeper than anything he had ever seen between people, almost as if they shared thoughts in ways humans could not. He began taking mental notes, trying to piece together their intentions. Sometimes, when he asked casual questions about where they came from or why they were here, their answers were vague. They spoke of traveling far, of seeking safety, and of seeing new worlds. But Evan noticed tiny slips in their stories. One day, Lyra mentioned seeing mountains that didn't exist anywhere on Earth, and Kayleigh casually spoke about a sky with colors he had never seen. Evan realized that their experience was far beyond his own, and while it was fascinating, it made him even more cautious. He couldn't simply trust them. There were moments when Evan caught them doing things that seemed almost impossible. They could sense movements in the room without looking, and once he swore he saw an object lift slightly off the floor without anyone touching it. At first he questioned his own eyes, thinking maybe it was a trick of the light or fatigue from staying up late, observing the stars, but repeated incidents convinced him that they possessed abilities he could not explain. That realization made him both fearful and determined. He needed to know why they were here, and he needed to do it carefully. Evan also noticed their interest in him personally. They would observe his expressions, his gestures, and the way he reacted to simple situations. It felt almost like a test, though he could not be sure. One evening, when he accidentally knocked over a cup, Lyra's eyes flicked to his hands and then exchanged a look with Kayleigh. Evan felt their attention as if it were weight pressing down on him. It was not threatening, but it was deliberate. They were measuring him, understanding him, and perhaps deciding whether he could be trusted. The thought unsettled him. As the days passed, Evan realized that normal conversation would not be enough to uncover their intentions, that were intelligent, careful, and possibly hiding things that he had no way of detecting. Simple questions were not enough. He needed a strategy. That night, after they had gone to rest, Evan sat by the fire, replaying all he had seen. He thought about their questions about his home, their silent communications, and the small hints of extraordinary abilities. He understood that if he wanted to know the truth, he would need to be clever, patient, and observant in ways he had never been before. It was then he made a decision. Pretending to sleep would allow him to hear their true conversations without alerting them. If he could remain still and quiet, he might catch them speaking freely, letting down the careful masks they wore in his presence. The thought was daring, risky, but he felt it was the only way to understand what was happening. Evan began preparing for the night, thinking through every detail. He would have to control his breathing, stay perfectly still, and wait for the right moment to listen. Every instinct told him that the answers he sought were just beyond the surface, and the sisters' true intentions could be revealed if he watched and waited carefully. Evan felt a mixture of fear and excitement. He did not know what he would hear or see, but the possibility of uncovering the truth drove him forward. He had lived a quiet, ordinary life, and now it had changed completely. The presence of Lyra and Kayleigh introduced mysteries, danger, and knowledge far beyond anything he had imagined. He understood that what he had begun was no longer just observation, it was a careful test of trust, intelligence, and courage. He could not afford mistakes. Every glance, every whisper, every movement of the sisters mattered, and he would need to notice everything by the end of that day. Evan had made up his mind. He would continue to act naturally, pretend to be unaware, and wait for the night when he could finally understand the sisters' real intentions. He knew that the coming days would test him, reveal secrets, and perhaps change his life forever. For now, he was ready to begin the most important observation of his life, the one that would uncover whether these strange sisters were simply travelers seeking refuge or something more. That night, Evan felt a strange mixture of excitement and fear as he prepared for what he knew would be a crucial test. The cabin was quiet, except for the gentle creaking of the wooden floor and the soft whistle of wind through the trees outside. He had decided that pretending to sleep was the only way to uncover the truth about Lyra and Kayleigh. Every detail mattered: the rise and fall of his chest, the soft movement of his eyelids, the way he positioned his hands. If he failed to appear convincingly asleep, the sisters might notice, and he could lose the chance to understand their intentions. He lay down on his bed, pulling the blanket lightly over himself, closing his eyes, and forcing his breathing to become slow and steady. His heart thumped rapidly at first, but he forced it into rhythm with the quiet of the night, convincing himself that he had done the right thing. Minutes passed in silence. Evan could hear the faint ticking of a small clock on the wall and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Then, softly, the cabin door creaked open. Evan's eyes remained shut, his body completely still, though his mind raced. Lyra and Kayleigh stepped inside. He could feel their presence immediately. They moved with the same graceful, silent elegance he had observed during the day. But now, in the dim glow of the cabin, their forms seemed even more ethereal. They paused for a moment, looking at him. Evan's stomach tightened. Were they aware that he was pretending? He forced himself not to move, not to even twitch. They began speaking, but not in English. Their voices were soft, melodic, and carried a rhythm that made Evan strain to understand. The words were unfamiliar, but their tone conveyed a mix of concern and caution. Then, one of them shifted to broken English, tentative yet deliberate. Lyra's voice whispered he must not know. Yet, Evan's mind raced. What did she mean? Why must he not know? He listened intently, trying to catch every word, every subtle inflection that might reveal the meaning behind their careful speech. Kaleigh's voice joined in, softer and almost hesitant. She asked questions that seemed to be about him, about his reactions, and even about his home. Can he be trusted? She asked quietly, as though fearing her own words might be overheard. Evan realized something astonishing. They were discussing him not just casually, but with precision, with judgment, and with consideration. They weren't talking about whether to harm him, but whether they could reveal something, or trust him with information they had kept hidden. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. They were intelligent, aware, and cautious in ways humans rarely were. Evan's mind worked quickly. Every whisper, every small movement of their bodies told him more than their words. The way Lyra leaned slightly closer to Kayleigh, how they exchanged glances and subtle gestures, revealed a silent language he could barely begin to understand. They seemed conflicted, almost anxious, but careful not to alarm him. Evan realized that these whispers were a window into their true selves, something he had not seen before. While they maintained composure when he was watching, when he appeared asleep, they allowed themselves to reveal a hint of uncertainty, a trace of emotion that made them more real, more vulnerable for what felt like hours. Though it was only minutes, Evan lay still and listened. They spoke of their mission, their fears, and the challenges they had faced in traveling across worlds. Words like danger, refuge, and integration came up repeatedly, but each time, they spoke in a tone that suggested hesitation, a struggle with what they had to do. Evan realized they were not invaders planning harm. They were travelers, perhaps refugees, but burdened with responsibilities and secrets that weighed heavily on them. Each word, Each whisper confirmed that there was far more to their story than he had imagined. Then came a moment that made Evan hold his breath. Lyra whispered something so softly that he barely caught it. "Can he be used without harm?" The phrase sent a chill through him, and yet it was not malevolent. There was curiosity, yes, but also an almost scientific detachment, as if she were trying to understand human potential or reactions without causing unnecessary pain. It was clear that they were testing him, evaluating his intentions, and perhaps considering whether to reveal themselves fully. Evan felt both fear and relief. They were powerful, cautious, and aware, but they had not threatened him directly. Kayleigh added a few words, almost a murmur. "Humans. Adaptable." Her voice carried a mix of wonder and worry, a question that seemed to linger in the air. Evan thought carefully about what she meant. Were they considering whether humans could accept them, trust them, or even survive alongside them? The questions were not just about him personally, they were about humanity, their place in it, and how much they could reveal without causing panic. Evan realized the stakes were far higher than he had imagined. He was not just an observer, he was part of a test, a bridge between worlds they had traveled to with care and caution. As the whispers continued, Evan noticed subtle shifts in their tone. It was not only their words but their hesitations, their pauses, and the small glances they shared that revealed emotion, fear, uncertainty, and even a hint of regret. They were conflicted, and it was clear that whatever mission or journey they were on was not easy. Evan felt a deep sense of empathy. These sisters were not invaders or monsters, they were beings far from home, cautious because they had to be, navigating a world that could be dangerous if misunderstood. He realized that trust would have to be earned, carefully and slowly. Evan also began to understand the complexity of their thoughts. They were calculating, observant, and aware of his presence in subtle ways. When he thought they were unaware, they were still testing him, still measuring how he might respond. The level of intelligence and awareness he was witnessing was unlike anything he had ever seen. He felt both awe and intimidation. He knew that revealing himself too soon could disrupt this delicate balance. Pretending to sleep was not just a strategy, it was the only way to truly understand them. The night deepened, and their whispers grew softer. They spoke about possibilities, contingencies, and what might happen if they revealed too much too soon. Evan felt as if he was peeking into a hidden world, one filled with complex decisions, emotions, and responsibilities that far exceeded human experience. The realization made him both nervous and fascinated. These were beings from somewhere beyond Earth, capable of thought, feeling, and decision-making in ways humans could barely comprehend. He felt honored and terrified at the same time to witness their true selves. Finally, after what felt like hours, Lyra and Kayleigh moved toward the door. Evan continued to lie perfectly still, holding his breath as they left. He could hear the soft click of the door and then the quiet settling of the cabin back into silence. Only then did he allow himself to exhale, his mind racing with everything he had just overheard. The whispers had revealed so much. They were cautious, intelligent, conflicted, and aware of him, but they were not hostile. He now understood that their intentions were not simple. They were beings far from home, struggling to navigate a world they did not fully trust, trying to decide whether humans like him could be allies, or at least understanding observers. That night, Evan lay awake, replaying every word, every whisper, every subtle movement he had witnessed. He realized that the task ahead would require patience, intelligence, and careful observation. He could not act recklessly, yet he knew he had the chance to understand beings far beyond human comprehension. Pretending to sleep had worked. For the first time, he had seen a glimpse of their true selves, conflicted, intelligent, and vulnerable. He knew that the next steps would be even more important, for what he had discovered was only the beginning of a much larger story. The night air outside the cabin was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. Inside, Evan sat quietly near the small fire, its warm glow flickering across the wooden walls. His mind replayed the previous night's events over and over. Pretending to sleep had allowed him to hear the sisters' conversations, and what he learned left him both awed and unsettled. He understood now that Lyra and Kayleigh were not ordinary travelers. Their minds worked with precision, their thoughts layered with caution, intelligence, and emotion that Evan could only begin to grasp. They were capable of incredible awareness, and their choices carried weight far beyond what a human could imagine. He knew he was approaching a turning point, a moment where their true intentions might finally become clear. Evan decided that tonight he would need to observe again, but differently. He could not simply pretend to sleep again. He needed to be ready for whatever they might reveal. He moved quietly to a corner of the cabin where he could see the sisters without being seen. His heart pounded, a mixture of fear and anticipation. Every instinct told him to stay calm, to focus on every subtle detail, the movement of their eyes, the tilt of their heads, the pauses in their speech. He realized that the smallest gesture could reveal something crucial. Tonight, he hoped, he would understand not just what they wanted, but why they were here, and what they truly felt about him and the world he lived in. The sisters entered the room as he had expected, moving with their usual grace. Evan noticed immediately that something was different. Their movements were slower, more deliberate, almost hesitant. There was a tension in the air that he had not sensed before. They glanced at each other briefly, and then at the room, as if checking for something he could not see. Evan felt his pulse quicken. The subtle change in their behavior suggested that they were aware of him in some way, or at least that they were carefully considering what they would reveal. He focused intently, trying to catch every shift in their expressions, every whisper that might slip past their usual careful control. Then came the moment that Evan had been waiting for. Lyra stepped closer to Kayleigh and spoke softly in their melodic language. Her tone was urgent, almost fearful, but gentle. Evan strained to catch the words. Though most of the conversation was in their native language, fragments of English slipped through. "He wants to trust us," Lyra whispered. Evan froze. That simple phrase carried more meaning than anything they had said before. It revealed that the sisters were not simply evaluating him for potential danger, they were considering trust, the possibility of connection, and the consequences of revealing their true selves. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink around him, the cabin silent except for the soft crackle of the fire. Kaleigh's voice followed, quieter, almost a murmur. "But will he?" The question was directed at Lyra, but the words felt like they were meant for him as well. Evan's mind raced. He understood now that the sisters were conflicted. They had been careful to hide their true intentions, to protect themselves from potential harm. But now they were questioning whether they could allow someone else, a human, into the truth. The hesitation in their voices suggested that revealing too much carried risks not just for them, but for him as well. Evan realized that this whisper, so soft and deliberate, contained the turning point he had been waiting for. He had uncovered a crack in their carefully constructed control, a glimpse of vulnerability that was both fascinating and dangerous. Evan watched as Lyra and Kayleigh moved closer together, their heads almost touching as they exchanged silent signals. He noticed a subtle change in their eyes, a flicker of emotion that he had never seen before. It was fear, yes, but also something deeper, doubt, hope, and perhaps even relief that someone in this new world might understand them. Evan felt a surge of empathy. He realized that they were not invaders plotting harm. They were beings far from home, navigating unfamiliar territory, struggling with decisions that carried consequences beyond his comprehension. The whisper he had heard revealed their inner conflict, and for the first time, he felt that he was truly witnessing their authentic selves. The sisters spoke again, this time more deliberately, their voices soft but carrying weight. Lyra murmured about choices and paths, and Kayleigh responded with uncertainty, asking whether they could trust humans, whether they could safely reveal who they were. Evan understood that their decision was not simple. They were evaluating him, yes, but also evaluating humanity, the risks of interaction, and the potential for understanding across worlds. The complexity of their thoughts left him breathless. He realized that their mission, whatever it might be, was not about control or dominance. It was about survival, ethics, and trust in beings who were entirely foreign to them. Evan's heart pounded as he listened. Every word, every hesitation, carried significance. The sisters were no longer speaking for themselves alone, they were speaking for the larger world they had come from, for the decisions that had brought them here, and for the unknown consequences of revealing their presence to a human. He understood that he was witnessing a pivotal moment, a test not of his strength, but of his patience, observation, and understanding. The whispers he had overheard were a window into a moral and emotional complexity far beyond anything he had encountered in his life. Time seemed to stretch as he watched. The sisters' movements became more fluid, more natural, as if the act of speaking softly to each other allowed them to relax slightly. They discussed strategies, contingencies, and possibilities, weighing every option carefully. Evan realized that these beings were not just intelligent, they were thoughtful, ethical, and deeply aware of the impact of their actions. Every decision mattered, and the question of whether he could be trusted was part of a larger framework of understanding and caution. He felt honored and frightened to witness this. Then came the final whisper of the night. Lyra leaned close to Evan's side of the room, speaking in a tone so soft it was almost a sigh. "He wants to trust us, but will he?" The words repeated, but now they carried clarity, finality, and a sense of weight. Evan understood fully that this was the moment of truth. The sisters were aware of his presence, aware that he had been listening, and aware that he was capable of understanding the implications of their words. The whisper was not a threat, nor a test. It was an acknowledgement of possibility, an invitation for trust, and a declaration of their own uncertainty. Evan's mind raced with the significance of what he had heard. The sisters were not plotting harm. They were uncertain, ethical, and wary, considering the consequences of revealing their true selves. The whisper confirmed what he had suspected all along. Their presence in his cabin was not a simple matter of seeking refuge. They were beings from another world, carrying knowledge, power, and moral responsibility far beyond his own understanding. And yet, in that whispered question, Evan sensed hope, a hope that he could bridge the gap, that understanding and trust were possible, and that his careful observation might lead to a deeper connection. The rest of the night passed in quiet tension. Evan stayed in his corner, absorbing every detail, every glance, every movement. The sisters eventually moved to rest, their whispers fading into the night. leaving him alone with the fire and the weight of what he had learned. He felt a mix of relief, anticipation, and awe. The whispers had revealed their true conflict, their inner struggle, and their cautious hope for understanding. Evan realized that the story was no longer about observation alone, it was about connection, trust, and the delicate balance between curiosity and caution. By dawn, Evan felt changed. He had seen a glimpse of the sisters' true selves, their fears, and their hopes. The whispered words echoed in his mind, carrying the weight of trust, ethics, and the unknown possibilities of interaction between their world and his. He understood that the next steps would be critical. The delicate thread of trust had been stretched across the room, and how he acted next would determine whether that trust could grow or break. The night had revealed their intentions, but it had also revealed the immense responsibility that came with understanding them. Evan's heart remained full of questions, but for the first time, he felt that understanding was possible. He had listened, observed, and witnessed a truth that was fragile, complex, and deeply human, even in beings not of his world. The whispers of the night had set the stage for the choices to come, and Evan knew that his next actions would shape the future of this unexpected encounter. The morning sunlight poured gently through the windows of Evan's cabin, painting the wooden walls with a warm glow. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth from the forest outside. Evan awoke slowly, feeling the weight of the previous night's revelations heavy on his mind. The whispers of Lyra and Kayleigh still echoed in his memory, their words carrying hope, fear, and a fragile trust he had never experienced before. He knew that the next steps would be crucial. He had seen their true intentions, glimpsed their vulnerabilities, and understood the depth of their intelligence. Now, it was time to act carefully, to bridge the gap between understanding and connection. The sisters were already awake, moving silently around the cabin. Their presence was calm, almost ethereal, but Evan noticed the lingering tension in their expressions. The whispers from the night before had not left them at ease. They were cautious, still wary of revealing too much. Evan understood that he could not rush them. He had to approach the conversation gently, with patience and empathy. He prepared himself mentally, taking a deep breath, knowing that this encounter could define the relationship between them and him, and perhaps shape the events that were yet to unfold. Evan began with small gestures, offering tea and bread, making light conversation about the weather and the forest. He observed their reactions closely, noting the subtle ways they responded to his voice, his tone, and his words. Unlike the previous days, they did not hide or mask their feelings entirely. There was a softness in their movements, a cautious willingness to engage. Evan realized that the whisper he had overheard the night before had opened a door that he could step through if he acted with care. He chose his words slowly, speaking honestly about what he had heard and how it made him feel. He expressed both his curiosity and his concern, showing them that he was not a threat, but an observer who wanted to understand. For a moment, silence filled the cabin. The sisters exchanged glances, their eyes reflecting a mix of relief and hesitation. Then Lyra spoke, her voice gentle but firm. She admitted that they were not from this world, that their journey had been long and dangerous, and that they had sought refuge here not to harm, but to survive. Kayleigh added details about their mission, about the threats they faced from those who pursued them, and about the difficult decisions that had led them to seek help. Evan listened intently, realizing that the sisters' true challenge was not just surviving in a new world, but deciding whom they could trust. He felt a deep sense of empathy for them, understanding the weight of their choices and the courage it took to reveal even a part of the truth. Evan then shared his own story, his life in the cabin, his fascination with the stars, and his years of searching for knowledge beyond Earth. He did not hide his awe or curiosity about them, and he spoke openly about the fears and questions that had arisen since their arrival. The sisters listened, nodding subtly, their expressions softening. They realized that Evan was not only intelligent and careful but also empathetic. He had observed without judgment, listened without fear, and respected the boundaries they had cautiously set. In that moment, a fragile trust began to form, bridging the gap between human and alien, observer and traveler. Over the following hours, the three shared more of their experiences. Lyra described the vast unfamiliar worlds they had traveled through, the challenges of survival, and the ethical dilemmas they had faced. Kayleigh spoke of the knowledge they carried, insights about life, energy, and the interconnectedness of beings across the cosmos. Evan absorbed every detail, fascinated and humbled. He realized that these sisters possessed wisdom far beyond human experience, and yet they were vulnerable, cautious, and seeking understanding in a world that was new and unpredictable to them. The conversation deepened their connection, each word, gesture, and glance building a bridge of trust and mutual respect. Evan noticed the subtle changes in the sisters' behavior. Their movements were less guarded, their glances less secretive, and their voices more natural. They asked him questions, not to test, but to learn. They wanted to understand humanity, his thoughts, and his feelings. They seemed genuinely curious about his world, just as he had been curious about theirs. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from one of tension and uncertainty to one of cautious openness. Evan realized at this moment fragile and delicate as it was, marked the beginning of a new alliance. It was not formal, not planned, but based on understanding, empathy, and the recognition of shared vulnerability. As the day progressed, Evan proposed a plan to help them remain safe while they stayed on Earth. He offered to guide them, to teach them how to avoid detection, and to assist them in navigating human technology and society. Lyra and Kayleigh considered his offer carefully, their expressions thoughtful. Finally, they accepted. There was no fanfare, no dramatic gesture, only quiet acknowledgement of the partnership that had begun. Evan felt a mixture of relief and excitement. He knew that helping them was not without risk, but he also understood that trust, once established, could lead to extraordinary possibilities. In the following days, they worked together to implement the plan. Evan showed them ways to move unnoticed, how to interact with humans in subtle ways, and how to maintain their safety. In return, the sisters shared knowledge that Evan had never imagined, insights into energy systems, methods of observation, and perspectives on life and existence that challenged his understanding of the universe. Their exchange was cautious, respectful, and mutually enriching. Evan felt a sense of awe and gratitude, realizing that he was part of a unique alliance, one that transcended the boundaries of species and worlds. Throughout this time, Evan observed the growing bond between the sisters. They were careful and deliberate, yet there was a warmth in their interactions, a connection that spoke of shared experiences and mutual reliance. He noticed that their initial fear and caution were slowly giving way to a willingness to trust, not just him, but the world they now inhabited. Their whispers, once secretive and cautious, became moments of genuine communication, revealing thoughts and feelings they had previously concealed. Evan felt privileged to witness this transformation, understanding that trust, once nurtured, could bridge even the most profound differences. One evening, as the sun set behind the forest, casting golden light across the cabin, Lyra and Kayleigh stood together, observing Evan. Lyra spoke softly, almost to herself. "We whispered because we were afraid." Evan understood immediately. The fear that had guided their actions, that had led to careful observation and whispered discussions, was not gone, but it had transformed. It had become a cautious hope, a recognition that trust was possible. Kayleigh added, "You listened because you cared." Evan smiled quietly. Their words encapsulated the journey they had shared, from suspicion and secrecy to understanding and partnership. In that moment, Evan realized the depth of what had occurred. The sisters had come seeking refuge, wary and cautious, and he had chosen observation, patience, and empathy. Together, they had navigated fear, uncertainty, and the unknown. The cabin, once a place of solitude, had become a space of connection, learning, and shared trust. Evan understood that this alliance, fragile yet profound, marked the beginning of something extraordinary, not just for him, but for the sisters as well. Their presence had changed his world, and he had changed theirs. As night fell, the three of them sat together quietly, sharing stories, observing the stars, and reflecting on the events that had brought them together. The atmosphere was calm, yet charged with possibility. Evan knew that their journey was far from over, that challenges still lay ahead, and that trust would need to be maintained and nurtured. Yet he also knew that the first and most difficult step had been taken. They had seen each other's truths, acknowledged fears, and chosen to act together. It was a beginning rooted in understanding, courage, and the fragile but powerful bond of trust. Evan finally felt a sense of peace. The sisters were no longer strangers, and he was no longer a passive observer. They had become allies, partners in a shared journey of survival, learning, and discovery. The whispers that had once carried uncertainty and fear had transformed into silent acknowledgement of mutual respect and hope. In that quiet cabin, surrounded by the forest and the stars, a new chapter of life had begun for Evan, for Lyra, and for Kayleigh, a chapter defined by trust, curiosity, and the possibilities that arise when beings from different worlds choose to understand and care for one another.